Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where we're coming from. Thank you to everybody who organized MHEC, Jason and your team, for bringing us all together today. Happy to share with everyone a working paper, the title, The Effects of E-Cigarette Taxes on E-Cigarette Prices and Consumption, Evidence from Retail Panel Data. This is joint work with a big team, Chuck Courtemanche, Catherine Maclean, Erik Nesson, Mike Pesko, Nate Tefft. We've all, the six of us in different pairings and groups have worked on issues related to tobacco control policies, cigarettes, e-cigarettes, et cetera, for a number of years now. And we decided to all join forces in one big team for this project. I unfortunately didn't take Tal's good advice here and get one of my co-authors to join me to answer questions in the chat. Considering there was like 28 of us, I probably could have found somebody to do that, but I wasn't able to think that far ahead. Anyway, real quick, just some acknowledgements or disclaimers for the lawyers. So research reported in this presentation was supported by the National Institute on Drug Abuse of the National Institutes of Health. And we're going to be using data from the Nielsen Corporation, accessed through partnership with the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. As such, the conclusions drawn from the Nielsen data are those of us, the researchers, and don't reflect the views of Nielsen. Nielsen's not responsible in any of this at all. So anyway, thank you guys. So you can tell from the title, we're looking at the effects of e-cigarette taxes and thinking about the e-cigarette marketplace. So a little bit of background and motivation about e-cigarettes. So e-cigarette use, we start to see climb notably about 8 or 9 years ago. In 2013, 2.4% of adults 18 to 24 years of age used e-cigarettes regularly. By 2018, it was estimated to be about 7.6%. And while smaller percentages, we see similar trend trajectories with older adult populations as well. And we see much bigger usage among adolescents. E-cigarette use among adolescents, the FDA estimates hit between 27 and 28% in 2019, and they estimated it was only 11% a few years before that. So we've seen rapid increases in vaping. This has led to not surprising concern among public health officials, which has then subsequently led to a focus on tobacco control policies aimed at trying to reduce the consumption and utilization of e-cigarette and vaping products. And, you know, as health economists, anytime we start to see more tobacco control policies come into place, it piques our interest. We're curious about what some of the effects are in that space. And the specific tobacco control policy we're going to be focusing on in this study is taxes. And there's been a large increase in the amount of taxes associated with e-cigarettes since March. As of March, we have about 23 states and several localities that have passed taxes on e-cigarettes. And although it didn't become a law in February, the House of Representatives approved a nationwide level e-cigarette tax. So we're seeing these taxes become widespread, and the idea of there being a national tax is actually something that's been on the table now for consideration. And so this begs a lot of policy-related questions that we would like to address. How do taxes impact cigarette prices? So what would the price pass-through kind of look like? How do taxes impact e-cigarette sales and use? And then also very importantly, for a broad understanding of what the policy relationships are here, is how are traditional cigarettes and e-cigarette markets and demand related? Now, up until really recently, trying to address these first two questions was really challenging because there just wasn't really any good data, specifically on e-cigarette sales or utilization, any of the surveys or any of the retail or scanner data or any of the usual suspects. And so some innovative researchers initially, starting about 5-ish years ago, started trying to estimate what the relationship was between traditional cigarettes and e-cigarettes by looking at kind of like the shadow effect of restrictions on e-cigarette utilization back into the use of traditional cigarettes. So, several papers tried to kind of figure out what degree of relationship we had between these two products. And the most notable group of them looked at restrictions on youth access to e-cigarettes. And by and large, what these studies found was that as we restricted access to e-cigarettes for adolescents, we saw an increase in traditional cigarette consumption from the same populations. That's not true across the board. There are a few studies that actually found the opposite, found evidence for complementarity, specifically the Book and Adams paper in the Journal of Health Economics and a few others. And then there were some other papers that also, again, looked at restrictions on indoor vaping or restrictions on e-cigarette advertising to try to get a sense of the relationship. But in all these cases, because of the lack of data, they were looking at how these restrictions kind of reflected back into use of traditional cigarettes. More recently, we've had some papers that have tried to get at some of those first two questions I brought up about what's the effect of, say, e-cigarette prices on consumption habits by looking at e-cigarette prices directly, not exogenous changes resulting from taxes, but just looking at the potentially endogenous prices on e-cigarette sales or e-cigarette use. Obviously, looking at just kind of the list prices has endogeneity and creates potential limitations. But that aside, these studies have found largely that the own price elasticity of demand for e-cigarettes seems to be pretty elastic. Lastly, I'll just note two papers that are kind of closely related to what I'm going to discuss with you today. The paper by Safer and co-authors that just came out in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty this year. And this is a case study focused on Minnesota. So Minnesota had the first e-cigarette tax. They passed it in 2010, and then they increased it in 2013. This paper uses a synthetic control approach to kind of look at this case study. And similar to some of the papers I was just referencing, they look at what the effect of this tax on e-cigarettes was on traditional smoking among adults and smoking cessation. Again, finding evidence of a substitute relationship here, that as the tax went up, we saw less traditional smoking. And they also generate the first estimate of tax pass-through, or price pass-through here. They found that about 133% pass-through of that tax for retailers in Minnesota, suggesting some degree of overshifting occurring in that specific marketplace. And then lastly is this contemporaneous piece here by Hunt, Alcott, and Rapkin. This is a working paper, and we've communicated with Hunt and them frequently in the past 12 months, sharing our papers. They're using similar data as they've got different model features, and we're not studying exactly the same outcomes of interest, but where outcomes do overlap, we're actually finding very similar results. So we kind of feel like the papers are really complementary to each other. All right, so what are the research questions that we're going to be focusing on with that background in mind? So our paper kind of breaks into two general research areas. The first one looks at how do e-cigarette taxes affect e-cigarette prices, so that tax to price pass through. Obviously, market concentration, the market structure is going to play a role here. So we'll also estimate what the HHI is for the e-cigarette sector. And then the second part of the paper focuses on these next two research questions, which are looking at calculating the own price elasticity of demand for e-cigarettes, and then also the cross price elasticity of demand for e-cigarettes and for traditional tobacco products by using the exogenous taxes of each type of product in a corresponding fashion. So of course, to do this, we need to have information on e-cigarette taxes. Our data is going to go up through 2017. So we're going to collect all the e-cigarette taxes that were put into place up until that point. And here's a list of them. Now, they break into, we classify them as localities because they break into largely state laws, which you can see that some states have passed adjustments to their laws. In some cases, they've made them larger taxes, in other cases smaller. We've got 8 states here, considering the District of Columbia as a state. And then we've got what we call sub-state laws, Chicago, Cook County, Montgomery County, et cetera. And Chicago's in Cook County, so we can roll those together. And that gives us kind of our 10 treatment locations. Now, important to note here is that e-cigarette taxes tend to come in one of 2 types, wholesale price kind of ad valorem approach, or a per fluid milliliter kind of per unit excise tax approach. Now, while we do look at these separately looking at the wholesale price ad valorem taxes versus the per fluid milliliter taxes and get very similar results. For our main estimates, we wanted to put these together. So to do that, we standardized the wholesale price taxes by using a standardization process. I'm not going to go through all this because of time, but basically it breaks down to like this. The District of Columbia calculates the wholesale price for e-cigarettes per fluid milliliter. And we can use that wholesale price calculation to, in essence, back out what an approximation is of the per fluid milliliter tax for each of the ad valorem taxing localities. So that allows us to bring all the taxes into a per fluid milliliter of vaping solution as our standard treatment. All right, and so here's just kind of a visual for everybody on the standardized e-cigarette tax in the fourth quarter of 2017, right at the end of our data. And you can see the variation here. States like Louisiana, Kansas, North Carolina, West Virginia have relatively low per fluid milliliter taxes, where Pennsylvania, Cook County, Chicago, Minnesota, and California have larger excise taxes implemented. So then we're going to take these data. We went out and collected a bunch of information on other tobacco control policies. So we're going to utilize information on cigarette excise taxes, tobacco 21 laws, indoor air laws, as well as an indicator variable for whether locality bordered a locality with e-cigarette taxes, to give us a set of tobacco control policies to include in our specifications. And then we're going to merge this policy data into our primary data set, which is the Nielsen retail scanner data. We're going to be looking at 8 years of data from 2011 to 17. We start with 2011 because that's when we start to see e-cigarette purchases show up with any degree of reliability in the data set. And the NRSD includes a sample of about 30 to 35,000 retailers nationwide, excluding Alaska and Hawaii. The data includes sales from food stores, mass merchandisers, dollar stores, club stores, drug stores, convenience stores, as well as liquor stores. And it provides us weekly data on about 2.6 million UPCs, so products at the UPC level, which they then categorize into 1,100 different product categories. The NRSD records weekly volume and average price of each of these UPC purchases. And we identify purchases and sales of e-cigarettes, traditional cigarettes, and then other tobacco products such as like cigars and chewing tobacco, et cetera, that we'll look at. But our main focus of the paper is e-cigarettes and traditional cigarettes. Now, as nice as this Nielsen data is, when looking at e-cigarettes as opposed to traditional cigarettes, you run into kind of a problem, which is that unlike traditional cigarettes, which have a really standardized unit of measure of a cigarette, so whether if the UPC is a pack or if the UPC is a carton, you can always break it down to how many cigarettes there are. So you can always kind of standardize any particular purchase by the number of cigarettes. With e-cigarettes, we don't have a standardized measure. It's just a purchase shows up as a UPC, and you don't really know how much, say, vaping fluid is associated with a purchase. There's different product types. We've got disposable e-cigarettes. We've got starter kits for the reusables, and then the refill cartridges for the reusables. Plus, a particular purchase could be a single cartridge. It could be a multiple cartridge kind of pack. And then the tank size of a cartridge can vary quite a bit as well. So a purchase isn't a purchase isn't a purchase. We don't have kind of a standardized measure here. So in order to kind of take the literature that step further and really have a more precise estimate of what we were looking at, what we did was we visited stores. This became uncomfortable at times, sitting on the store looking at packs of e-cigarettes as people ask us where to find things in the Walgreens, and then having to explain to them you don't work there, get weird looks. Internet searches, conversations with manufacturers. So what we did was we matched the UPCs back to the Nielsen data and then included their product characteristics. So we were able to match 94.5% of e-cigarette product sales to the detailed product characteristics that we collected. And this gave us information on the product type, what was the flavor of the e-cigarette, which is becoming increasingly important in recent years. So whether it was traditional tobacco flavor, menthol flavor, or one of the more exotic flavors like bubble gum or grape or lemonade or something. And then importantly, the liquid volume in milliliters, so that we could standardize every purchase down to how many milliliters of fluid were purchased. Okay, so this brings us to our kind of first research question, which is how do e-cigarette taxes affect e-cigarette prices, that kind of pass-through question. And before we got to that, recognize that the SAFER paper, when they calculated this for Minnesota, had a price pass-through of 133%. And so that made us ask this question, well, what is the market concentration in this environment? Can we calculate a Herfindahl index for e-cigarettes in a retail setting? And so we did. We looked at 100% of e-cigarette products in the NRSD, and we were using a standard method to calculate what the Herfindahl index is. And we arrived at a mean HHI over the 8 years we looked at of 0.245. Should point out, probably not surprisingly, as e-cigarettes have become more popular, we've seen more entrants into this market, and this Herfindahl index declines during this period of time down to about a low of 0.15 in 2017. Needless to say, if we look at the Department of Justice kind of classifications for industry concentration, they say anything above a 0.25 is highly concentrated, and between a 1.5 and between a 0.15 and a 0.25 is moderately concentrated. So for the 8 years we're looking at here up through 2017, e-cigarettes were sold in a moderate to highly concentrated industry, which definitely suggests some degree of imperfect market competition, which would allow for the overshifting that the SAFER paper found, and leads us to our analysis. Well, what do we see if we look at a more comprehensive approach? If we look at more the nation as a whole with more tax variation. And so we start with the standard two-way fixed effects approach here, where our left-hand side is the average price for e-cigarette products, UPC level, in a particular locality, which is mostly states, quarterly. And our primary treatment variable of interest here is going to be the e-cigarette taxes per fluid milliliter in that locality. We're also going to control for traditional cigarette taxes, other tobacco policies that I discussed earlier, characteristics of the locality, so some demographic information, as well as like unemployment rate, do they have a Medicaid expansion in place, beer taxes, things of that nature. Fixed effects, which will be UPC by locality fixed effects or year by quarter fixed effects, cluster or standard errors at the locality level. And then we're also going to estimate event study versions of this model to look for differences in pre-trends and things of that nature as well. All right, so what do we find? First, I've got four kind of regression specifications for models here. As we move from left to right, they're just increasingly adding more controls. So let's just focus. And so what we're looking at here, I should point out, is again, the treatment variable interest here is the standardized e-cigarette tax. So this is the tax, dollars per milliliter of fluid, and the outcome variable is the e-cigarette price per milliliter of fluid. And just focusing on the fourth estimate here, that is our primary estimate. What we find here is a price pass-through of about 149%. The confidence interval includes the SAFER estimate of 133%. And so this suggests a high degree of overshifting is taking place that is consistent with a more imperfectly competitive market, or at least possible in that scenario. Now, we also, as I said, undertook a couple different event studies here. And so it's hard to do a classic event study when your treatment variable is kind of set up as a continuous measure. We don't have like a classic event. Not only do we have, where our treatment is a tax amount, but the taxes change within the same location over time, and sometimes they go down. And actually, in multiple occasions, they've actually gone down. So we had to kind of be creative with setting up event studies. So we do it two different ways. The first way we do is we just dummy the nominal taxes. So if there was a nominal change in the tax, increase or decrease, we just we put a dummy in for just the increases and look to see what that looked like. And this is going to mute the size of the estimates, but we don't see any pre-trend effect. And you can see the post-treatment after tax increase in the estimates. And then the second way we did it was to make it more like what our actual estimation process is we use the actual nominal tax changes themselves, similar to a paper that myself, Erik, Nesson, and Tefft did in a Journal of Health Economics publication a couple of years ago, where we were looking at cigarette taxes. And so this isn't exactly quite like an event study in the sense that the events have different sizes. But when we do this approach, we get similar sort of idea. We don't really see a whole lot happening in the pre-trends, and now you start to see the post-tax effect, the treatment effect, show up pretty clearly. All right, the other thing we did was we beat up on these estimates with just a whole bunch of robustness checks. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we looked at different analytical samples, different modeling assumptions, different weighting schemes, and I think there's 16 or 18 different robustness checks here. And what we find is that estimates from these robustness checks range from about 106% pass-through to 162%. All the estimates are significant at the 1% level. But this range is actually wider than what's really fair to the robustness checks. All of them but one were between 130 and 162%. There was only one estimate that was lower, this 106%, and that was when we simply looked at just the sub-state localities and dropped all the states. And for our purposes, we kind of felt like that made some sense as smaller geographic regions, it's gonna be easier to avoid the tax. So the ability to pass the tax through might be more limited for the retailers. We also did a leave-out analysis where we systematically left out each one of the 10 treatment localities, and the estimates are pretty similar. I did a falsification exercise. I'm just gonna skip this for time, but it worked out. Okay, second set of analyses that we looked at was trying to answer these questions about how do e-cigarette prices affect e-cigarette sales, so own price elasticity of demand, and then how do e-cigarette prices, or also consequently traditional cigarette prices, affect sales of other tobacco products. So looking at cross price as elasticity as well. So our setup here is, our main setup is going to be an instrumental variables model where the outcome of interest is sales of a particular tobacco product, so like e-cigarettes or traditional cigarettes in a particular locality at a particular time or quarter. And then as its instrumental variables, we're going to be using e-cigarette and traditional cigarette taxes to instrument in the first stage to predict e-cigarette prices and traditional cigarette prices in the model. Other variables are basically the same as in the pass-through equation that I showed earlier. So I can just kind of skip through this. And again, we'll cluster our standard errors at the locality level. Okay, so what do we find? Let me walk everybody through what the setup here is. We've got two regressions, two outcomes of interest: e-cigarette sales and traditional cigarette sales. And we've got two treatments of interest: the predicted e-cigarette price and the predicted traditional cigarette price. So we've got four coefficients of interest in these two different regressions. So to start, focus here on this coefficient estimate. This is looking at the effect of e-cigarette prices on e-cigarette sales. And we find a $1 increase in e-cigarette prices reduces e-cigarette sales by roughly 29% off the baseline mean. And that backs out to roughly an estimated price elasticity of demand for e-cigarettes of minus 1.3, suggesting that e-cigarettes are an elastic product, that there's a high degree of price sensitivity here. Noting that this is a younger population that focus on this is not super surprising to us. If we now switch over to a well-established estimate, which is the effect of traditional cigarette prices on traditional cigarettes, we see that a $1 increase in cigarette prices reduces cigarette sales by about 13%. This backs out to a estimated own price elasticity of cigarettes of minus 0.77. Again, inelastic, as you know, historical literature would have suggested. It's a little bit more elastic than some of the older estimates, but pretty much in line with some of the stuff we've seen recently, which I think makes sense if you consider the degree of substitutes for nicotine delivery that have come on the market over the, let's say, the last 10 to 15 years. Now we shift gears and focus on the other two estimates in the table, which are looking at the relationship between the products, or the cross price elasticities. We find first looking here at the effect of traditional cigarette prices on e-cigarette sales. $1 increase in cigarette prices translates to approximately 24% increase in e-cigarette sales. Backs out to a cross-price elasticity of about 1.4. So seems like the purchasers of e-cigarettes are pretty price sensitive to the price of e-cigarettes and to the price of the substitute as well. And correspondingly, again, suggesting substitutes here. And correspondingly, we also find a substitute relationship between e-cigarette prices and traditional cigarettes, although the cross-price elasticity here is more inelastic. So we've got substitutes both ways, but a little bit of asymmetry between them. It maybe is not terribly surprising. Users of traditional cigarettes are a little bit less price sensitive than the other way around. Okay, we also did a reduced form approach of this setup where we just use the actual taxes explicitly in the model. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'll just share the kind of the general findings are basically very, very similar. We find that the price and cross-price elasticities for e-cigarettes are very close to what we estimate with the IV model, more price sensitivity in the e-cigarette market, and same goes for the traditional cigarette market, less price sensitivity, but a very similar overall pattern. Again, showing that e-cigarettes and traditional cigarettes seem to be pretty good substitutes for each other, and maybe increasingly so over time. The next thing we did was here, I got about 8 minutes left, was look at, we took the same IV sales model, and instead of just looking at, if I back up in my slides here real quick just to make it obvious, instead of just looking at e-cigarettes as a product or traditional cigarettes as a product, we broke these categories up by flavor. So we took our e-cigarettes and broke them up into 3 flavor groups: non-flavored e-cigarettes or tobacco flavored, menthol or mint e-cigarettes, and then the more exotic flavors, the lemonades and grapes and bubble gums of the world, and then split traditional cigarettes into the 2 classic flavors of tobacco, traditional and menthol. And then went back and looked to see how e-cigarette prices and traditional cigarette prices affected sales by flavor type. And what we found here is if you focus on kind of the more classic tobacco or menthol flavors, we found a $1 increase in e-cigarette prices reduced e-cigarette, this kind of like traditional flavors, by 23 to 26%. But if you compare that to the more exotic flavors, we found a much stronger effect, that a $1 rise in e-cigarette prices reduced flavored e-cigarette sales by 41%, or there's a much greater sensitivity there. And for us, you know, at least anecdotally or what we read, there seems to be an association between these flavored e-cigarettes and younger populations. And to the extent that we would expect younger consumers to be more price sensitive, this seems to make sense. Further, when we looked at how e-cigarette prices affected the substitution effect over to traditional cigarettes, there was a stronger response into the menthol cigarettes, that we found a greater substitution towards menthol. And if people are using the flavored e-cigarettes are then shifting over to traditional cigarettes, we would expect that to possibly be the landing spot for more consumers. We also looked at, extended these IV sales models to the effect of e-cigarette prices or traditional cigarette prices on cigars, chewing tobacco, loose tobacco. And without getting into it too much, we don't really find much of an effect anywhere for any of these products, maybe suggesting that these products have started to kind of differentiate themselves enough from e-cigarettes and traditional cigarettes where they're not really as closely related as maybe they once were years ago. Definitely not as closely related as we're finding e-cigarettes to be with traditional cigarettes and vice versa. Okay, so some general conclusions and takeaways that we have from our results. So we estimate that the e-cigarette retail sector is moderately to highly concentrated, although maybe that is the evidence seems to be that is becoming less concentrated over time. We estimate that e-cigarettes have a tax to price pass-through rate of about 149%, which is consistent with overshifting, which is a possible in an imperfectly competitive environment. It's technically possible in a perfectly competitive environment, but we don't find evidence in our data that would support that, that hypothesis. And I think our greatest takeaways are that there's a notable substitution between the products, and it suggests that further e-cigarette taxation that's not considered in concert with the tobacco control policies of traditional cigarettes is going to potentially lead to an increase in traditional cigarette consumption. That policymakers probably should think about traditional cigarettes and e-cigarettes and think about the public policies that affect them kind of in unison, because there's going to be this natural flowing back and forth between the two. We also estimate the effects on flavored e-cigarettes and find that the price sensitivity is greater, that there is a disproportionate impact of taxes on flavored e-cigarettes. And again, we think this is consistent with the suggestion that young people are more price sensitive to tobacco products in general. And lastly, in other research, there's evidence to suggest that e-cigarettes may be an effective smoking cessation tool. And so there could be unintended consequences of implementing e-cigarette taxes on reducing quitting of traditional smoking. So this, I think, summarizes our formal conclusions. I have one more visual, which I think summarizes them informally better. It's this cartoon for you all. But anyway, I appreciate the time. I look forward to the comments. And if anybody's interested in the paper, it is available on the MBER website. It's working paper 26724. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Chad. Could you unshare and see if Yang can share her slides?
Hi, everyone. Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Wang. I'm at University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a great pleasure to read and discuss this paper by Chad and his co-authors. I will start with a quick summary. Let's see how. So this paper looks at effects of e-cigarette taxes on e-cigarette prices, sales, and sales of other tobacco products. It develops a new method to standardize e-cigarette taxes because different places use different methods to tax e-cigarette, and also use two-way fixed effects and instrumental variable methods and the Nielsen retail scanner data from 2011 to 2017. It finds a tax to price pass-through ratio of 1.5, meaning if you increase tax by $1, the price increased by more than $1. So that's the kind of overshifting consistent with the Herfindahl index of 0.245, indicating a moderate to highly concentrated market. This paper also finds e-cigarettes' own price elasticity and the cross price elasticity with traditional cigarettes. Those two products are substitutes. And the paper also finds that e-cigarette taxes disproportionately reduce flavored e-cigarette sales. And this paper makes a lot of contributions. The main ones include developing a new method to standardize e-cigarette taxes, so other people can do the same. It's among the first to estimate the pass-through rate for e-cigarette tax. It's also the first to examine heterogeneity in e-cigarette price elasticity demand by e-cigarette flavors. And overall, my comments is on a very important topic. It's very clear estimation and identification strategy, has tons of robustness checks and very important policy implications, also very well written. So it's quite challenging to discuss this paper. So I'm just gonna share some of my thoughts. So the first is about teens and young adults. So Chad has mentioned that in his presentation already. This e-cigarette is super attractive to teens and young adults. As you can see in this graph here, back in 2018, 18 to 24-year-old are more likely to use cigarettes than people of other age group. That's why back in mid-2019, when Wisconsin signed a law to have e-cigarette tax, our governor made it very clear that the main reason is because our teens are really using e-cigarette. It turns out in 6 years, the e-cigarette use among high school students increased tenfold. So because the teens and young adults are such a focal population for any policy related to e-cigarette. So even though I understand, as the paper explains, that the Nielsen consumer panel data covers a very small e-cigarette sales, I still think it might be worth it to try using that part of the Nielsen data just to try to answer all the questions that this paper answers, but for young adults, for the specific groups. So, and beyond questions answered in the paper, we can also figure out whether the tax affects sales at intensive or extensive market, whether it could put people to quit and things like that. And I think policymakers will be very interested in answers to these questions. And my second thought is kind of going back to Wisconsin passing the e-cigarette tax last year. It was made clear that Wisconsin's reliance on tobacco tax revenue was undermined by declining use of traditional cigarettes. And Wisconsin depends more on tobacco tax revenue than most other states. So I'm thinking that at least for some states, when they pass any policy, including e-cigarette policy about e-cigarette, it's not just about public health, it could be revenue or budget concern. So my concern would be maybe when economic conditions going bad, then there's some policy change in e-cigarette tax, and that also will lead to change in sales in tobacco products. So maybe it's possible to check whether the timing of any policy change in e-cigarette tax can be predicted by states or other localities' financial situation. And maybe it's also worth it to control for more measures of economic conditions like GDP, poverty rate, and even social safety net programs, because I don't know whether for e-cigarette income elasticity is positive or negative, and that could all matter. And my last comment or thought is about this new product, in case you don't know. This new e-cigarette product the company is called Juul. It started in 2015, and towards the end of the sample period. It has very sleek and modern design. I think my reading is the founders graduated from Stanford Design School, so that's why you can see it's super nice looking. And it's super attractive to young people, young adults, which goes back to my first point about relevance for young adults and teens. And this company quickly seized the market. So in October 2018, a year after the sample period ends, the market share for Juul was 75%, and this number is even higher today. So Juul is one company single-handedly pushed the HHI index above 0.5. So now it's a highly concentrated market for e-cigarette. And not just that, their product is also different from other e-cigarette. They have one of the highest level of nicotine. Other e-cigarettes start at 1 to 2.5%, and they start with 5%, and then made another product with 8% nicotine. And then their pods, those little thing you saw, each pod has roughly as much nicotine as an entire pack, 20 traditional cigarettes. And I really doubt anyone, when they smoke the Juul, they will stop 5% into the pod and think, okay, now I have smoked one traditional cigarette in terms of nicotine content. Let me just stop here and wait until tomorrow. I think most people will finish the whole pod in one setting, and that's 20 cigarettes. And also, they have a new formula that increase the rate and amount of nicotine delivered to blood. So all of these features make their product even more addictive than other e-cigarettes, and e-cigarette is already kind of addictive for young people. So all this makes me think that now with a highly concentrated market, what will be the new pass-through rate? I think it's going to be probably a different number. And because it's a new product with such a high market share is super addictive, what will be the self and cross-price elasticity now? And finally, given this new feature of this new product, is it still reasonable to measure e-cigarette sales and tax using the liquid, the milliliter of the liquid in each cartridge. So overall, I think it's a really good paper. I learned a lot, and you can see I Googled a lot, just try to understand this paper, and I look forward to seeing it in publication. Thank you.
Chad, we have a couple of minutes. If there's anything that Yang said, either about your paper or about Jewel, that you'd like to comment on, and then we'll break for the author rooms in a couple of minutes.
I'll just say thank you. Those are wonderful comments. And yes, the Jewel is their product is something we've discussed quite a bit. It's taken the market by storm, but like you mentioned, it's been pretty recent. So we're kind of waiting for future waves of data to try to see how it may have impacted the market in general and things like that. But thank you for those comments and the attention you paid to the paper. I appreciate it.